How's it going, guys? Welcome back to the channel. I am an avid herpetologist, and we are officially in the full swing of the BT16 format of the Digimon TCG. It's shaping up to be a pretty exciting format. We've got lots of top decks, we've got lots of tier 2 decks, lots of tier 3 decks. The format is shaping up to be fairly diverse. We've got your quick, aggressive decks like MetalGreymon and MetalMamemon. We have our slower control decks, things like Rapidmon and Megadramon X. It's shaping up to be a lot of fun. There's a lot of things that you can be doing in the game to suit lots of different playstyles, but as always, I am going to be your king of copium. We are still going to be playing my big metal boy, Machinedramon. Now, is Machinedramon good in BT16? No. Anyways, that's going to about do it for today, guys. Thank you all for joining me for another video. But in seriousness, you have to be realistic about Machinedramon. Machinedramon is, and always has been, a reasonable rogue deck. It is a deck that does still have a pretty high skill cap. It has a pretty low floor, but it also has a pretty high ceiling. I actually think that BT16 is very much a format that is going to be dictated by a couple of very specific gatekeeper cards. Now, not all of these cards are going to be in tier 1 decks, but they are going to dictate whether or not your deck is able to survive in the current format. The 3 cards specifically that I think are going to be gatekeeping the format the hardest are, of course, Megadramon X, Rapidmon X, and Tyrant Kabuterimon. If you do not have an answer to these 3 cards, your deck is going to struggle. With that being said, as far as Machinedramon is concerned, I do think while the deck still struggles with some consistency issues, it does have pretty solid viable tools to deal with all 3 of these cards. For Tyrant specifically, of course, we have plenty of DP buffs to get up and over that oppressive body. For Megadramon X, we once again have those DP buffs. We can get over even a buffed and immune Megadramon. But outside of that, this is also a deck that has a ton of disposable blockers to keep it from reproccing its effect, and spammable de-digivolve, which is fantastic against Armor Purge. Lastly, of course, we have Rapidmon X, with Machinedramon being one of very few decks in the entire game that has good, consistent access to DP reduction immunity. That's going to mean that not only is it immune to Rapidmon itself's DP reduction, it's also immune to Heaven's Judgment, a card that is absolutely everywhere in the BT16 format. This actually gives Machinedramon, in my honest opinion, a pretty good shot at actually contending a lot of these top decks. Now, this, of course, does not mean that Machinedramon is top tier. It is still going to be struggling with consistency issues. I have been hearing a lot of people say the deck is still too slow for the format, and I don't necessarily think that's true. I think if you build your deck the right way, it absolutely can be fast enough to keep up, even with some of the faster decks like MetalMamemon. I've actually traded pretty consistent 50-50 wins, I would say, with the MetalMamemon players at my locals, who are pretty good, solid players in their own rights. With that being said, again, Machinedramon is kind of the pinnacle of a toolbox deck. It has the tools to handle a lot of these different strategies, and as long as you build your deck correctly and learn to pilot it smoothly, it can have good responses to these different strategies. So today, of course, we'll be looking at my current take on Machinedramon in the BT16 format, talking about some of my tech choices, and some of the cards that let you do this. Or if you're in the mood, potentially this. Or even, if you're feeling frisky, this. Machinedramon is still very much a deck that has the teeth to potentially compete, so let's talk about some of the new additions, let's talk about some of the new ratios, and I'm going to show you guys how I think is best to pilot Machinedramon with the current format. So with all of that preamble out of the way, let's get into it. Alright guys, let's go ahead and get into our deck list. Now, we have a lot to talk about today, so I'm going to be doing my best to kind of summarize some of the cards that we've already talked about a million times, and focus more on specific reasons for specific techs, and kind of other alternative choices you might have if there are things in here that you may want to swap around. First thing, as always, we're going to be talking about is, of course, our eggs. I am still going to be playing 4 copies of Kyokyomon. Now, Kyokyomon is an egg that lets you draw a card anytime something is unsuspended on your opponent's turn, whether that's through reboot, whether that is through them having something that just unsuspends naturally, or of course a plethora of unsuspend effects that are going to be floating around, whether it's going to be Mirage Galgamon, Megadramon X, Megagargamon Ace, there are quite a few to be discussed, but this will trigger for all of them. Now, ultimately your egg choice is going to depend on whether you want one of two things. Do you want extra draw power or an extra DP buff? If you're looking for draws, I think Kyokyomon is probably one of the better options that we have at the moment, unless of course you're going to be continuing to run the Marvin package. If you are not running the Marvin package, in which case you would probably not want Doraemon anymore, we basically have a couple of other options. There are actually other Doraemon that I think are viable, or honestly I think the other best choice that you have at the moment is, of course, Kyokyomon. If you are looking for a DP buff, you basically have to decide, do you want a DP buff on your own turn, in which case Hotmon is going to be where you go. If not, Tumblemon is going to be your best friend. It really is going to depend on your particular list and the problematic matchups that you have and what answers you particularly are looking for. I'm going to be going with Kyokyomon because we are playing quite a few reboot inheritables, so we're going to be looking to trigger that ourselves as often as we can, and setting up multiple copies of Kyokyomon under indestructible bodies like HoverEspimon is fantastic. I love getting all of those extra draws turn after turn, so 4 copies of Kyokyomon for me, but you do have other options if you would rather not run it yourself. Alright, moving into our rookies. Of course, we're going to be starting off with our 4 copies of BT16 Hagurumon. This Hagurumon is, in my opinion, a mandatory 4 of. It's the best searcher the deck has access to, and of course has that nice reboot inheritable. Being able to add a Tamer and a Digimon to your hand is of course fantastic, but we don't need to go too much more into that. You guys know why this Hagurumon is so good. We're also playing 2 copies of EX1 Hagurumon. I'm opting for these 2 just because I wanted a little extra consistency in my particular list, but we are going to be playing 3 copies to go on top of them, the brand new Hagurumon X-Antibody. Now, Hagurumon X is 3 to play, of course can Digivolve on top of another Hagurumon and has 2000 DP. When Digivolving, you can play a Co-Hagurumon token. That token is black, has 1000 DP, but does not have a play cost or level. It's also a blocker, has Decoy Black, and on your turn cannot declare an attack. Even nicer, Hagurumon X also has a blocker inheritable, which pairs wonderfully with our BT15 Hagurumon, meaning we can get reboot blocker just from our rookie sources, which is really, really nice roll compression. Now, one of the things about Hagurumon X that I think needs to be discussed is just how valuable this token can potentially be. Not having a play cost or a level means there's quite a bit of removal in the game that actually can't touch this token. The fact that it's decoy also means it's an extra layer of protection, which is way more valuable than I think a lot of people realize. But the biggest boon that I personally have found with this token is the fact that since it is a very disposable blocker, it's going to be fantastic in the Magnamon X matchup. Being able to throw our token in front of a established Magnamon X, preventing them from re-triggering their ability unless they have Blinding Ray, is going to be excellent at helping us regain control of the board. I think Hagurumon X is honestly a fantastic control piece. It's a very nice benefit to the deck, and I'm very happy to have it as part of my list. Now, between EX1 Haguru and Haguru X, I've gone between a 1-4 and a 2-3 split. I'm currently playing 2-3 because, as I mentioned, consistency is still a bit of a problem for Machinedramon, and I want to have that extra ability to dig when needed, but Hagurumon X can absolutely be played as a 4 of, so again, it's going to be kind of up to you and how you decide to build your personal list and the issues that you decide that you have had in your experiences. So this is what I'm going to be doing for my rookie slots. I'm just playing these 9. Let's go ahead and move into our champions. We are still playing 3 copies of HoverEspimon. This card is still an absolute unit. It still is fantastic and very frustrating for quite a few decks to deal with. And as I've mentioned in my last deck profile for Machinedramon, this card pairs extremely well with Hagurumon and Kyokyomon, where if you Digivolve on top and you can verify a safe check, it basically has jamming where you can swing in, get that free check, unsuspend. Now you get a free draw off of Kyokyomon and have potentially a blocker that is immune to deletion effects. This card is fantastic against quite a few decks in the meta. I'm still going to be playing 3 of it because I think it is potentially the best champion that we can be running at the moment, but we are going to be playing 2 others. We're currently playing 2 copies of BT15 Guardromon. He's 5 to play, 2 to Digivolve, and has 5000 DP. Has native blocker and an on-play when Digivolving effect to trash a machine or cyborg from your hand to give any Digimon on your field immunity to destruction effects until the end of your opponent's turn. On your turn, if your opponent has no Digimon to play, this Digimon cannot attack, with another nice reboot inheritable, so good redundancy there. As I mentioned, I want to try to get that nice blocker and reboot consistently on my stacks without having to commit potential level 5 sources, and as a result have actually cut back on my level 5 reboot and blocker sources. We're only playing 1 of each this format. Now, this Guardromon is interchangeable with plenty of other level 4 options, but I am going to be trying this guy out because I have found him extremely helpful, again, against quite a few very specific matchups. I think Guardromon's value is only going to go up as we move through future formats because we are going to eventually be receiving Cyberdramon Ace, which is a big buff for Machinedramon, and keeping that Cyberdramon Ace safe once you have Blast Digivolved into it will be vitally important. So having that Guardromon where we can proc that immunity, immediately Digivolve into our level 5, and hopefully keep that level 5 safe for a turn so we can properly go into our Chaosdramon on the following turn is going to make the deck a lot more difficult to play around and can potentially force our opponent to stay in the raising area just a little bit longer, which is big if you are talking about controlling the board and keeping pace with what our opponent is doing. So I'm going to be trying 2 copies of Guardromon out, but if you are looking for a good alternative, allow me to introduce you guys to BT16 Gladiemon. This is a Digimon I'm actually heavily considering trying out this format. He's 5 to play, 2 to Digivolve, has 4000 DP, another reboot inheritable, so we're not losing out on that, but it trades all of the native effects for jamming, which works extremely well with our Kyokyomon egg, where even if we don't have our reboot Hagurumon in our sources, we can swing for a jamming check on our opponent, Digivolve on top of it afterwards, and then unsuspend with our level 5 and almost guarantee a draw off of our Kyokyomon egg. So if you're looking for an alternative, I do highly recommend trying out Gladiemon. I think it's actually a bit of a hidden gem in this particular core. Now, it's not a machine or cyborg, so it's going to be missing some of those synergies that you may like it to have. For instance, we can't add it off of our Hagurumon, but I do think it is worth considering. So think about trying Gladiemon out. I do think it is potentially worth a spot, but for me personally, I will at least be starting the format with our boy Guardromon. Now, there is one other level 4 I'm going to be running, and that's a single copy of Raremon. I know Raremon's expensive, but he is still very much a card that is kind of difficult to replace. He does double duty being a nice cheap to play level 4 that also happens to have a dig effect and a reasonable inheritable that actually can put in a lot of work in a lot of situations. Being able to delete level 3 bodies off the board can help more go-wide decks from taking over the game state, and honestly, again, just an extra dig tool is super, super nice. This is also a card that, if it does wind up in your trash, Chaosdramon X can actually tuck this in if you need to get a little bit of extra removal to push for game. So there's lots of reasons I would say to consider running Raremon. I'm currently just going to be running 1 because I want to keep my level 4 line relatively clean, kind of skimmed. So we're going to be playing a total of 9 level 3s and a total of 6 level 4s. All of my level 4s are Digimon that I would not mind playing directly from my hand. Same thing with a lot of my level 3s here. So we're trying to rely not too heavily on our lower end, but being able to Digivolve in our raising area or push forward early and protect our stack with things like HoverEspimon, Hagurumon, or Guardromon's protection, all fantastic. So these are all just things to consider. As I mentioned, Gladiemon is a nice option too, who also plays really well with Hagurumon X. So if you do happen to go the Gladiemon route, I would probably max out on Haguru X, just because having that token will help protect the level 5 once you Digivolve on top of it. All things to consider. There's a lot of things to kind of take into account with building the base for a Machinedramon deck. This is still very much a deck that suffers from having too much support and not enough space. So this is what it's going to be for my lower end, and that's going to about do it for that. Let's go ahead and start talking about our level 5s. Now, as mentioned, I did cut my reboot blocker inheritables down to 1 each. The ones I've chosen are going to be MetalGreymon from EX4 for my blocker inherit, and Gigadramon from BT15 for my reboot inherit. Both of these are cards that I'm more than happy to play from my hand, especially off of things like Supreme Connection, which is why I've opted for these 2. But they've also got completely generic inherits, which is super helpful in a format where de-Digivolve is a sincere possibility. We don't want to potentially be losing access to these effects if they happen to de-Digivolve us, so we're going to be playing these 2, MetalGreymon being a blocker while in play, and Gigadramon being additional search power when played directly from hand. Super, super nice. So that's going to do it for that. Now, I am still playing one of the original EX1 cyborgs, and that is, of course, MetalMamemon. Having an inheritable that can remove opposing bodies is just as valuable as ever. MetalMamemon is still awesome against level 5 Ace Digimon, and is honestly just good again for controlling the board when there are quite a few decks in the format that are going to be going wide. Things like Numemon, Tyrant Kabuterimon, being able to remove the extra bodies is vitally important, so having 1 copy of MetalMamemon, I definitely recommend playing that, if not more. But again, I personally will be just running the 1. The other removal inheritable I'll be running is going to be still BT9 Megadramon. Megadramon is still one of few cards in the game that is going to give you access to Tamer removal, and honestly having that when Digivolving effect that can also remove a Digimon in play is really, really nice now that we're in a format where Ukomon is going to be everywhere. Being able to have our level 4s Digivolve into this and pop Ukomon, preventing them from getting more value, something you really need to be keeping in mind. We need a way to deal with those rookie bodies pretty quickly, and Megadramon is a way to do that, much like Raremon's Inheritable. So having that access to spammable removal, that is going to be important. Keep in mind that Ukomon probably will be in a lot of the top decks. Having an answer to it main board, you're going to need it. We are still going to be playing, of course, our 2 copies of MetalGreymon going right alongside with that. As mentioned, again, same thing with the when Digivolving effect. It is going to have an answer to Ukomon for you while still having that vitally important attacking unsuspended bodies. This, of course, is going to be how we are going to be able to swing in and potentially handle Magnamon X-Antibody, being able to swing over it. Fantastic, of course, but they're going to most likely be leaving it unsuspended to block with, so we're going to need a way to access it before the turn passes back to them, so we can force them to have another one, or basically just lose the stack. And speaking of losing the stack, also vitally important in this format is going to be our 2 copies of BT16 Megadramon. As I mentioned, spammable de-Digivolve is vitally important. We are entering into a format where aces are becoming more and more common, with powerful new cards like Valkyremon and Vicomon, as well as recurring threats like Azulongmon still making appearances in a lot of the top decks. Megadramon being able to de-Digivolve aces to gain a ton of memory is of course fantastic, but being able to modulate our opponent's level so they can't blast in the first place is also super helpful. So I'm going to be playing 2 copies of Megadramon, not only because he's got a fantastic surge effect, but having spammable de-Digivolve is going to be important. There's also going to be a lot of armor purge, and de-Digivolving is one of the easiest ways to get through that. So 2 copies of Megadramon, 2 copies of MetalGreymon. Both of these cards I think are definitely worth being played at 2, and are going to be some of your most valuable resources this format. Now let's go ahead and start talking about our DP buffs. I am going to be playing our single copy of MetalGreymon from BT1, as well as a single copy of Megadramon from BT6. These are going to be giving our generic plus 3,000 and plus 2,000 inheritables. If you have access to both of these, of course, Machinedramon and Chaosdramon can both swing over potentially Magnamon X, and will also help us to be getting over our Tyrant Kabuterimons, but we are playing other buffs in other areas. Again, something we'll talk about a little bit later. But having both of these as format, I do think is non-negotiable. You are going to need to get over things that are going to be 15,000 or higher consistently. These are the cards that are going to let you do that. So you need to be running both. That is my personal opinion. You know, feel free to disagree with me in the comments below, but I think these 2 are vitally necessary. And in that same vein, I am also still playing our single copy of Gigadramon for the same reason. Again, DP buffs, they're going to be important, making sure that our opposing Magnamon X's cannot swing through our level 6s without potentially losing the stack. Vitally important, guys. Be able to get to 13k or 14k consistently, force them to have to play through it. Do not give them the option of just swinging and stripping your sources. Play these 3. I do think they are vitally important. DP buffs are bigger than they have ever been before, as a lot of the top decks are going to be massive bodies with tons of immunity. Sometimes you just have to brute force it, and these are the cards that let you do that. Alright, we are of course still playing our extra security checks. We have our copy of MetalGreymon as well as Megadramon. Megadramon joining the ranks of MetalGreymon and BT9 Megadramon as a card that is going to help us deal with in-play Ukomons nice and early on, so of course we have that. And I am playing 2 copies of cards that trash opposing security in the form of MetalTyrannomon and Rapidmon. Now these are cards that I do think are potentially cuttable. If you want to go down to just one of these in favor of something else, I think that is actually completely fine. As I mentioned, there is a lot of armor purge this format, so if you're really worried about not being able to trigger these consistently and you want to cut these for something else, by all means, go for it. I honestly don't really know what I personally want to play in place of them. I have considered potentially either like MetalGreymon Ace or BT7 MetalGreymon, just because they're so cheap to play from the hand and can let you reestablish a wiped board very, very cleanly. So those are definitely contenders to replace these with, but there's also going to be decks where having these will just kind of auto-win the matchup by being able to strip your opponent's security while also controlling their board. Not every deck obviously has Armor Purge, and especially against decks like MetalMamemon, you're going to need to be deleting their bodies pretty frequently. This is going to let you continue to push advantage while you're doing that. So this is going to do it for my level 5 lineup. As I said, this is still very much a deck with an absurdly deep support pool. If you are playing a different lineup, totally fine, but hopefully my reasoning for each one of these inclusions will at least ring true. There are things that I do think will be non-negotiable this format. Specifically, I think you should be playing 2 copies minimum of Megadramon and all 3 of the potential TB buffs, but everything else is kind of up to you, how you want to tailor your list. And honestly, if you have other tech choices that have been working really well for you, leave them down below. I actually really like hearing the comments from you guys, and I'd love to hear what things have been working well for you. So that's going to do it for my level 5s. Let's go ahead and get into our level 6s. Now, of course, we're still playing 3 copies of our big boy, EX1 Machinedramon. Very much the centerpiece of the deck still, thanks to Supreme Connection. And of course, as I mentioned, has that vitally important immunity to DP reduction. Being able to just shrug off Heaven's Judgment is huge this format. Being able to not get shrunk by Rapidmon X, again, also huge this format. Machinedramon is something that I would recommend playing no less than 3 right now. And going right along with it, we are playing our 3 copies of Chaosdramon. Now, this is another thing where if you decide that you want to play 4 copies of Chaosdramon, that is completely fine. Of course, that is totally up to you. But currently, I'm only running 8 level 6s, again, just for consistency purposes. I don't want to be running too many things on my top end. So currently, we've just got our 3 Machinedramon, 3 Chaos, and our 2 copies of Chaosdramon X-Antibody. Now, for all the people saying Machinedramon is too slow this format, you're going to notice I'm not playing BT11 Machinedramon. I do genuinely believe that we have now reached a point in the game where the speed of the game has probably outpaced BT11 Machine. If you are hoping to evolve into BT11 Machine and you don't already have Analogman in play, you're going to have a very, very bad time. Machinedramon from BT11 is pretty expensive to set up. You need to go all the way up into a Mega and have a 4-cost Tamer in play, and you're not always going to have time to be able to do that without already needing to make a pretty big tempo swing play. So I'm omitting BT11 Machinedramon because I think there are plenty of other tools that we have to dig at this point. I don't think he's really necessary, and I think his combo is a little too slow to keep up with a lot of what these decks are doing right now. I do think that this is probably all you need for BT16. Now, I've also toyed around with potentially playing a single copy of Megagargomon Ace, but to be completely honest with you guys, he hasn't really done much in the games where I've seen him. I feel like every time I really want Megagargomon Ace, either he's not in my hand or my opponent already knows that I have him and can play around him pretty cleanly. He's also something that's very easy to punish. Since he doesn't have protections, he is pretty easy to just kind of clean off the board just outright. Now, obviously, it is nice to be able to just windmill slam a level 5 and have an ace to back it up, but if your opponent has an out to your level 5 without having to attack, there are plenty of decks that do that, like Mirage and, once again, MetalMamemon, you're not necessarily going to be able to make use of the Megagargomon Ace anyways. And especially since a lot of these decks are having the removal tied to DP reduction, even if they don't kill your level 5 outright, if they shrink it, you're not going to be able to block with your Megagargomon Ace anyways, and it winds up kind of being superfluous. Now, that's not to say that Megagargomon Ace isn't unplayable in this deck. It absolutely is. It's still a very solid card, but I'm omitting it from my deck for those reasons. I've just found that he's just too easy to counter, I've found that he's too easy to play around, and I would rather just keep to my clean machine plan here and just keep the rest of my space available for additional digging tools. And yeah, that's pretty much it. That pretty much wraps up our level 6 machine talk. Now, there are going to be other things to kind of keep in mind with how you are playing your level 6s this format. For instance, we've talked a lot about MetalMamemon. MetalMamemon is going to be one of the top decks this format, and there are going to be some kind of weird things that you may have to do if you want to do well in that matchup. What I mean by that is having something like, for instance, our EX1 Machinedramon in play and digivolving immediately into Chaosdramon X-Antibody. Now, this may not seem super great on the surface because obviously, Chaosdramon is what's going to be allowing us to tuck sources. We're not going to get anything bonus by doing this. But here's the thing. Decks like MetalMamemon have not only lots of DP reduction, they also have access to potential de-digivolve thanks to Warumanzemon. So we really need to be able to keep our DP reduction immunity while also having protection from potential de-digivolution effects. Don't be afraid to make this kind of play in the right matchup. Now, you have to be careful because some decks that also have access to both, like Rapidmon for instance, have the ability to de-digivolve you with their own Rapidmon and potentially DP reduce you, but they also have the additional answer of Gargamissile, which can easily just wipe the stack off the board if you don't have Chaosdramon in your sources. So there's just a lot of things you have to kind of be mindful as you're playing and kind of think, what are the immunities that I need and what are the things I have to play around? Don't be afraid to make these unconventional play patterns. It may not seem great on the surface, but it can greatly increase your chance to win against some of the top decks of the format. So keep this in mind. Do not be afraid to make plays like this, even though they may not seem optimal on the surface. It could potentially win you certain games. So just something to keep in mind. All right, let's go ahead and move on. We're going to go ahead and get into our Tamers. Of course, we still have our 4 copies of Analogman. You shouldn't ever be running less than 4, in my opinion. This is still the card that very much lets Machinedramon be the threat that it is. Those redirects are obviously still super, super great. It's going to let Machinedramon be the defensive bulwark that he is. But this format, we are trading our Marvin package, and I'm going to be continuing to run 2 copies of Structure Deck Tai. We've already talked a lot about how valuable just having brute force DP buffs is going to be, and Tai is definitely a fantastic option in BT16. Having that DP buff that if we do not have, for instance, our Gigadramon that can help our Machinedramons stay above Magnamon X, that's going to be really nice to have, and having a draw attached to it is pretty much just icing on the cake. I honestly do think that the Tai package probably outweighs the value of Marvin in this format, so I strongly recommend playing 2 copies of him. But again, depending on how much space you have in your personal list, you may run more, you may run less as far as Tamers are concerned, but I'm going to be running 2 copies of Tai to back up my 4 copies of Analogman. Having the memory setter, of course, is nice on its own too. I am still playing my 4 copies of Supreme Connection, right up there with our Hagurumon, competing for the best searcher the deck has access to. Checking your top 5, being able to add to hand, as well as trash a source, gives you access to 2 additional resources, on top of having the fantastic delay effect that lets us make massive swing plays on follow-up turns, and is definitely one of the scariest security checks our opponent can potentially find if they are not killing us outright, making our deck extremely powerful in the crackback category. So 4 copies of Supreme Connection, and wrapping up our list, we are still playing 2 copies of Attack of the Heavy Mobile Digimon. This is another card, just like many others, where you can run more if you want, but you definitely, if you're especially going to be relying on Supreme Connection, shouldn't be running less than 2. I was running 3 last format for quite a bit. I may bump it up to 3 as well this format, but as I keep mentioning, space is kind of tight. I'm hoping that 2 is going to be enough and that a single blitz is going to be enough to potentially clinch the game, or at least very much devastate our opponent's board and give us the opening we need to close the game out before they can recover. So 2 copies of our blitz, 4 copies of our Supreme Connection, and that, my friends, is going to finish up my Machinedramon list for BT16. As I've already mentioned, if you guys have any questions or comments about the list that I'm running or want to share your particular tech choices, feel free to leave those down in the comments below. And hey, check the description of the video. I do have a link to my Discord in all of my videos, and we are constantly talking about Machinedramon and fresh new spicy brews. So if you're looking for the hottest Machinedramon techs, the newest spice on the market, feel free to hop on in. We are always happy to have new people join us to discuss one of the coolest decks in the entire Digimon TCG. With that, I am an avid herpetologist. I do hope you all have a great rest of your day. Thank you for joining me for another video, and I will see you all next time.